Now we're going to talk about Yanina, the largest Romaniot Judeo-Greek speaking community in the Greek peninsula. It's in northwest Greece, of course, eradicated in the Holocaust. But for sure, we know since the 900s that there was a Jewish community there when the city was established, and it lasted uh, without interruption until the Holocaust. In the region, Jews had been there since the late classical period in regions in cities like Paramithias and Parga, and those regions also the Jews traditionally raised the etrog, since it was a warm climate. So Epirus was the center for the Romaniot Jews, except for the capital of Byzantine and Constantinople, which became Istanbul, but they retained the Romaniot identity. So they were there since the 9th century CE. A reference to a Jewish presence in Yanina dates to the Byzantine era, when letters of Emperor Andronicus II mention local Jewish slaves. By the time Yanina was conquered by the Turks in the 15th century, the city was a growing independent community. At the end of the century, Jewish refugees began arriving from Spain and Sicily and integrated into the Romaniot community. Jews also came from Apulia in Italy. At that point, there were two synagogues, one for the old community of Romaniot and the other the new one of the Italian Jews. This book was by Ray Dalvin, The Jews of Yanina, basically the only book on the Jews of Yanina, and it's in English. During the 16th century and 17th century, the Jewish community of Yanina numbered 7,000. However, the population began to drop at the end of the 19th century, and the Jewish population was 5,000. In the early 20th century, high communal population estimates noted 7,000 local Jews. In 1910, the community numbered 3,000. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Jews primarily migrated to New York because, like we said in other sections, the Ottoman Empire was breaking up. Jews were fearing forced conscription if the Young Turk Revolution would be enacted, and also Jews were facing economic devastation, and for them it was time to leave. After the Greco-Turkish War, 1919 to 1922, the economic situation deteriorated, and many Jews also immigrated to the United States, Turkey, and France, while a small number left for Palestine and settled in Jerusalem. On the eve of the Second World War, approximately 1,950 Jews were living in Yanina. The city's Jews lived in two quarters. One was located within the walls of the old city, called the Castro, and the Jews were also outside the walls in the new city. Though there were tensions, relations between the Jews and the local inhabitants tended to be cordial. There was a large fire in 1951. In 1972, there was a blood libel, and there was always tension in the market between the Greek Orthodox and the Jewish merchants. The Jews' reputation was for they were silversmiths, and they produced a lot of Judaica. The Jews also worked as goldsmiths, painters, glaziers, and coachmen. This shifted during the 20th century when most Jews worked in commerce and half the city shops were owned by Jews. There was a famous Jew named Effendi Levy who in 1876 was in the Ottoman Parliament, and he was a financier. He had banks in many places in the Balkans, and he was honored. He also was revered by Greece because in the 1897 Greek-Turkish War, when Turkey took Greek soldiers prisoner of war, he worried that the Turks wouldn't harm the Greek soldiers, and later he was decorated by Greece for that. Separate boys and girls schools were established in 1904 by the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Instruction was in Greek, Hebrew, Turkish, and French. The boys' school had 420 students, while the girls' school had 160. There was also a school for the arts, as well as a vocational training school that was established by the Italian government. In 1910, Yanina was considered to be a Zionist center of the Epirus region. In 1923, the Zionist organization Amal Zion was active in the city. In 1923, there were 4 active synagogues in Yanina, 2 which were Romaniot synagogues, and 1 which was a synagogue serving the Sicilian Jews living in Yanina. there were 2 synagogues in the old city and 2 synagogues in the new city. Now today, the original synagogue from about 1822 is in the old city. The community maintained a club that sponsored lectures on Jewish topics and established a charity organization, Gemilut Chasadim, and a Jewish old age home. These were partially funded by Yanniot Jews who had already migrated to America. Other community organizations include a Chevra Kadisha and a Bikur Cholim Society for the Sick. At the same time that the Jewish community was flourishing, new laws were being passed that made life increasingly difficult for the Greek Jews. In 1923, a law was passed punishing army deserters. In practice, it was only used against Jewish soldiers. Because of the passage of this law, several Jewish families were deported from Yanina. Another law was passed in 1924 forbidding commerce on Sundays. This affected Jewish merchants who could not work on Sunday. They had to desecrate this Shabbat if they didn't want to lose a 6th day of work, or they migrated because they didn't want to work on Saturday. Additionally, in the community of Yanina, there were significant economic hardships during the period. In 1922, community leaders sent a letter to a rabbi in Jerusalem explaining that they were no longer in a position where they could send their financial support. Also, I think it's significant to say that the Jews of Yanina, like most Jews, were devoted to the sovereign. So the Ottomans were the sovereign, and the Jews had a relatively well life under the Ottomans and a religious and communal autonomy. So they didn't rebel. The Greek Orthodox rebelled. They wanted their own state. The Greek state was formed in stages. So Epirus, like Macedonia, only became Greek in 1912, whereas Greece became independent in the south, in the Peloponnese, for example, and Attica in 1821, or officially in 1833. In Thessaly, which was part Romaniot, part Sephardic, they became independent in 1881, or part of Greece. So the Ottoman Jews were hesitant to be part of Greece, and they didn't join the Greek nationalist struggle. So in one incident, 9 merchants were killed and their ears were put in envelopes and sent to the Jewish community, and it was the saying that if you don't join the nationalist struggle, this is what's going to happen to others. This frightened the Jews, but they didn't convince them, of course, to join the nationalist struggle. So in the beginning of the 20th century, by different accounts, there were 4,000 Jews living in Yanina. In America, they call Yanina Janina, Jannina. On the eve of the Nazi persecution, the community had only 2,000 members. Indeed, the Jews of Yanina were the first core of the Jewish community of Athens, where the old synagogue was called Ioanniotiki. Those are the Yanina Jews, which was formed at the beginning of the 20th century. As stated by the historians Joseph Nechama and Nikos Vase, the first Jewish presence in Epirus dates back to the time of Alexander the Great, who, according to tradition, brought Jews from Palestine. According to another version, after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, the Romans captured the Jewish slaves and imported them to Rome. When the ship anchored in Parga, the Jewish prisoners settled in Epirus. There's also another tale that there was a shipwreck, and that one of the Sifrei Torah, the Torah scrolls that the Jewish community had, was from that shipwreck sometime after the Roman victory over the Second Temple. Historically speaking, however, it's most likely the Jewish community in Yanina was formed in the 8th, 19th century by immigrants from Nicopolis and Epirus. Besides, during that period, Yanina was becoming a significant urban center. Jews had been living in the region, not in the city actually, observing their own tradition, manners, and customs and religious rituals. There was a personality, Yosef Eliah. He died very young, but he was the Greek Jewish, let's say, author, poet, person of the arts. He was like a communist and a radical, but he tried to introduce the Bible and Jewish literary tradition into Greek society. So he would translate many of these works, like the Song of Songs or Job, and then give it not just a literal translation, but of course give a commentary also. So even though, let's say he died at the age of 30, 31, he had written many, many works and books, and he's revered in Greek society. The Jews settled in the area inside the citadel and on Joseph Elias Street, once called Max Nordo Street, in the New City. The locals called this area the Megali Ruga, the Great Alley, which was the heart of the Jewish community. Jews also settled on Kandurioti and Levadioti quarters. Today, several old Jewish homes are still standing and are monuments of the architectural heritage of the city. These include the two Levi residences, Mordechai Raphael residence, the Moises residence, and many other typical folkloric homes.